So with the global interest in space growing, we've seen billionaires pioneering the exploration of space by civilians. And South Africa is not completely out of that race to space too. In fact, a Cape Town-based company has pioneered the world's first commercial electrical propulsion technology that's designed to actually fling satellites into space. Jonathan Lunn won the Singularity University Global Solutions program back in 2017 for his innovative solution. He currently joins us now via our video link. He's also the CEO of the company behind the innovation, Hypernova Space Technologies. And Jono from Cape Town, great to see you. Thanks so much for making time for us here on the AM Report. I want to start perhaps with just the broad strokes about what on earth is happening in space, right? So help paint the picture for us. To what extent is a country like South Africa, a developing nation on the tip of Africa, even a player in the race to space?
Thanks so much for having me on the show. So most people don't actually know that South Africa has had a space program for quite a while now, and it all actually started as early as the 1980s. South Africa had a secret space program during the apartheid era, and had developed their own launch capability. They had a rocket, they had a satellite that was about to go into space. And then just as we changed into a democracy, that program got shut down. And a lot of that skill set and the capabilities actually still remain in the country. And another grassroots foundation came out of that, where universities like Stellenbosch had students starting to build their own satellite. And South Africa launched their own first satellite in the late 90s. And out of all of that experience, many of those people ended up founding space companies, many of them in the Western Cape. So today we have about a dozen commercial space companies providing hardware to satellites that are flying up almost all the time. So it's a little known fact that South Africa is punching above its weight to provide our mark on the space industry.
That's fascinating. So as you and I speak today, I mean, what kind of presence do you reckon we have in space? And I mean that not just literally, but I mean even just perhaps metaphorically, like in conversations around space activity. How high up the list does South Africa come up?
Well, I mean, South Africa has its own space agency, so they engage very much on the UN level and on the intergovernment level. But we also have commercial players that provide a lot of hardware for commercial missions, like for the US, for Europe, for many other countries. So, yeah, I think we can be pretty proud that there's actually be surprised how much South African hardware is on satellites flying today.
Fantastic. And why is that important, Jono? I mean, for ordinary South Africans who are saying, look, we've got enough problems on our plate. Whatever happens on space is the least of our concerns, let alone the kind of hardware we're able to put there ourselves. What would be your response to those people?
Sure. So many of these satellites have direct applications for studying and observing the Earth. Some of them are also used to provide communications. And so in a sense, space is very much integrated with society and with how we operate in our everyday lives. So I wouldn't say it's very much removed, actually. It's integral in the same way that you have GPS on your phones. We can do video calls, and we're going to soon very much have internet beamed down from space. So, yeah, I think very much space is actually, like any other industry, integrated with our economy.
Right. We should care about what's happening in space as we do about what's happening on our land, essentially. But significantly today, we're speaking to you because the company you lead has pioneered what's called the first commercial electrical propulsion technology. Break that down for us in English, please.
Sure. So I'll probably need to just define it a little better, but currently most satellites don't have the ability to maneuver around in space. So they get launched on a rocket, they fly, they land up in orbit, but they're essentially now tumbling computer boxes in space, and they can't change direction, they can't avoid colliding with each other. So that's where the propulsion system comes in. It's like this little engine that pushes the satellite with very little force, and it can help it maneuver. And So I wouldn't say it's the first, but I would say it's the first in the sense of a completely different way of pushing satellites around. Most systems today generally use like a gas or a liquid that's very expensive or toxic or under high pressure. Think of it like a fire exhaust extinguisher. Yeah. And that system is it's really complicated. It's expensive. If something goes wrong, it can create huge problems. And so we actually, as a company, Hypernova, has come up with a way to do away with all of those complications and have a simple plug-and-play system that uses solid metal as a fuel. So there's no gas, there's no pressurized liquid or tank, no valves. It's just literally like a block of metal, some electronics, and the system's ready to go.
Wow. I've never heard of metal actually being used as fuel. How durable is that? I mean, because I imagine at some stage, there's that ancient old saying, what goes up must come down. Stuff in space doesn't necessarily follow that logic. So how long does the fuel last, and what does it enable you to do through this propulsion whilst in space?
Sure. So most people try and put their satellites up not too high so that over time, over time the atmosphere can slowly cause the satellites to have some drag and then fall back to Earth and dispose of themselves. But if you go above that orbit, or a certain orbit, those satellites take a really, really long time to come down, like decades or hundreds of years before they can come back to Earth. So you need a way to dispose of them safely. And so that's also where propulsion comes in, where you can now actively dispose of these satellites before they end up being space junk and a danger to other satellites in the future.
Right. And let's speak a bit more about that. I've heard many activists actually trying to sound the alarm around how much waste actually exists in space. And I imagine it's because of things like the fact that we could never really control where the stuff we send in space eventually goes, which is what this propulsion enables you to do.
I would say it's not really much about not being able to control it, but there's no incentive to actually get rid of it. And a lot of the incentives is around regulatory and who's going to actually pay for the stuff to get removed. So there's a lot of companies out there that are starting businesses to actually remove space junk. And there were some demonstrations done, I think, earlier this year. But I think the real problem is incentivizing governments and companies to solve the space debris problem. In the same way that the oceans are getting polluted, who's going to pay for them to get clean? Because polluting the oceans affects everybody, but who's going to actually get it done?
I mean, who put the stuff up there to begin with? Isn't that a good place to start?
Yeah, it gets into quite a legal tangle because it's nation states where the satellite launches from that are responsible for that launch. But then if your satellite crashes with someone else's satellite, then whose fault is it? Because both of them didn't have propulsion on and they didn't have control, so who's liable? So it's like a very interesting legal thing that's happening now in the community to figure this out.
Yeah, and it's a whole different world, quite literally. If people want to learn a bit more about what you do, how do they get plugged in to at least learn of the programs you've been involved in and ways through which perhaps they could also be a part of it?
Cool. Yeah, so later next month, I'll be speaking at the Singularity U Summit. That will be a virtual conference. If you can go to, type in Singularity U South Africa, and you can find details there. And you can also check out our website, hypernovaspace.com.
Awesome stuff. Jonathan Land, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us.